It is my joy this morning to welcome back our guest minister for our Easter service today is Reverend Art McDonald, Minister Emeritus of the First Universalist Church of Essex, longtime ECHO activist, and a great friend of this church who has preached here on multiple occasions. We're delighted to have him back for our Easter service this morning. And now,
I do see a few bonnets out there. At the church that I served for many years, we had a big tradition of everyone wears Easter bonnets on Easter Sunday, so you can get creative. And the woman back there, who's my spouse, has a beautiful bonnet. So if you want to copy that for next year, you're allowed. Do you know, when my wife Melanie and I first encountered Unitarian Universalism and trying to understand it all, we went to a church outside of Pittsburgh where we lived for many years. And when we walked in the foyer, there was a little notation. Unitarian Universalists believe in just about everything. We're very inclusive. Probably the only thing that Unitarian Universalists don't believe in is the resurrection. And my wife said immediately, "What's the problem with the resurrection? What a great idea it is. New life, new energy." So here we are celebrating the resurrection and imagining what that might mean. So God of Easter and infrequent spring announced a large covenant to deceitful lands, drive the sweet liquor through our parched veins, lure us to fresh schemes of life, rouse us from the tiredness, self-pity, whet us for use, fire us with good passion, restore us in love of living, and bind us to fear and hope again.
we light our chalice this morning on a day that honors two ancient stories, the Passover story, in which the sea parted open to guide a people to liberation, and the story of Easter, in which a stone rolled away to reveal the power of life and love over death. May our faith today, in all our diversity, lead us forward a transforming and a liberating love.
They say ministers have to wear many hats, right? So I have to change my hat. And I have some friends out there. You're here for solidarity, right? Is that why I need solidarity. So the we people here probably are saying, do we have to sit through this part? We want to go on this Easter egg hunt, right? That's what today's about. The Easter bunny and eggs. Well, it is, for sure. The bigger story here, of course, is this amazing story from a few thousand years ago about this great preacher who everyone thought, or at least his friends thought, he rose from the dead. It's a lot to get your mind around, right? But if we just focus on renewal of life, an opportunity to just think things differently and new energy and new life, that's resurrection for all of us. But so the Easter bunny, yeah, that's fun, but I'm not going to talk about the Easter bunny today. I'm going to talk about another bunny. Anyone know where I'm going? Come on, someone knows where I'm going.
Bugs Bunny?
Bugs Bunny. What's up, Doc? Remember that? Thank you. Thank you. So there's this fellow named Benito Antonio Martinez Ocasio, born in Puerto Rico and now famous as the Bad Bunny. Anyone watch the Super Bowl halftime? I know you didn't watch the game, but so I know you probably turned it on at halftime and turned it off right after, right? Yeah, that's what I figured. Anyway, the Bad Bunny. I'm amazed that the NFL, the National Football League, pulled this off, because you know it made some people very unhappy. Anyway, the Bad Bunny. Do you know how he got the name Bad Bunny? Well, he was 6 years old. I guess when he went to school, he was 6 years old. And the teacher every year, I guess, had someone dress up. And he was asked to dress up as a bunny. And he did not like it. He was very unhappy about it. So he decided, I'm going to be bad. And that's how he came up later with the name Bad Bunny, this now famous rapper. This famous rapper. Anyway, that's how he got his name. But I want to leave you with two things about the Bad Bunny. I don't know what you heard when you saw him. There were some people in this country who said, I'd turn that off because who can understand what he's saying? Everything's in Spanish. Well, about 15% of the population's first language is Spanish, right? So you start with 15% who can understand it all, and then maybe another 10% who learn Spanish as a second language. And maybe a lot of us could do that. We people, language is so important. So anyway, lots of people speak Spanish. So a lot of people understood it. If you could follow the rap, I mean, a little hard. He had two messages that I took away. You took away probably some others. One is the value of language and culture. This is his culture. He grew up speaking this language. All sorts of culture is embedded in language, and he shared that with us. What a rich thing, because at our best, we live in a country with lots of cultures, lots of ethnicities, lots of stories. And when we're at our best, we raise up all these different cultures, and it makes us better. The second thing he left us with was, and maybe from here on out, if we catch ourselves saying, I'm an American, we might catch ourselves and say, well, I'm not exactly an American, like this is the only place where we Americans. He came out with all these people from different, maybe 35 countries are all Americans. And they all had flags from their countries of origin. We are all Americans, not just the United States of America. Someone said the other day on the news, one of the casters said, oh, there are 4 people up in space right now, 3 Americans and 1 Canadian. What? Canadians are Americans, right? We know that. So 35 different countries are part of the Americas. So we're all Americans. So what a message to take away. And what a message to a wider population in our country. That we are all one, we are all Americans. And when we raise that up, we're so much better than we can be otherwise. So yay for Bad Bunny. And Rabbit. So lastly, I'll leave you with this. So we have an annual event in church, a talent show, in quotation marks. Anyone can, do their thing. So my wife and I, Melanie back there with a great bonnet, I call myself the Good Rabbit, rather than the Bad Bunny, the Good Rabbit. And we did a rap. I won't do it now because I'll embarrass my wife and probably all of you, but we did this rap based on the Bad Bunny and his message, so don't forget we're all Americans.
On Living Resurrection by Dorothée Zoulet. The resurrection cannot be discussed in isolation, as if it had nothing to do with the cross. As if Jesus would, in any case, even if he had died of old age, have gotten the benefit of this wonder drug. If we keep before our eyes what this puzzling phrase, resurrected from the dead, says, then the reality cross belongs to it. Whoever lives in love has to reckon with contempt, abuse, discrimination, even with death. In this other way of living, the resurrection is already visible long before death. Jesus believed above all and for all in a life before death. The resurrection, the spark of life, was already in him, and only because of this, God in him, were they unable to kill him. It simply did not function. Even today, the powerful do not succeed in extinguishing this love of justice, this sustained interest in the last.
This is my favorite Easter story from Luke's Gospel because of the impact it had on so many people. Now, that very day, two of them were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus, and they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. It happened that while they were there debating and conversing, Jesus himself drew near and walked up to them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looked downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, said to him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place in these days?" And he replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus, the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people. How our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to death sentence, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that you would be the one to redeem Israel. And besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had seen a vision of angels who announced he was alive. Then some of those with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had described. But him they did not see. And he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, how slow in heart to believe all the prophets told you. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and enter into glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and the prophets, he interpreted to them what referred to in all of the scriptures. As they approached the village to which they were going, he gave them the impression that he was going on farther. But they urged him, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he did stay with them. And it happened that while he was with them, he took bread, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. With that, their eyes were open, and they recognized him, but he vanished from sight. Then they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So they set out at once and returned to Jerusalem, where they found gathered the 11, and those were saying, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." Then the two recounted what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
Singing
Well, folks, great to be here. It's been a while. It's always a privilege to be asked. Hoping you still have your fastball, you know. So a curious Unitarian Universalist decided he wanted to go to a Christian revival gathering just to have the experience. While there, he was asked whether or not he wanted to be baptized by being totally immersed in water. Why not, he thought. So he's pushed down and dragged back up and asks, well, did you find Jesus? No, he responded. So they dunked him again. And they pulled him back up and they said, well, did you find Jesus? No, he replied. After several more dunkings, I think that's a word, dunkings. This time, as he came up and they asked, did you find Jesus? As he gasped for breath, he said, once again, no, are you sure he fell in here? So I guess I could have entitled a sermon, Finding Jesus, but I thought many of you might not be looking for Jesus. Maybe he'll stay away. So I decided to take the next step and calling it Reclaiming Jesus, since we do have some history of being in the Jesus camp. That might be more risky, I thought. Maybe some would say, oh no, I left Jesus behind long ago. You know, a friend of mine, there's this expression, I'm a recovering Catholic or recovering Christian, you know. A friend of mine was in a discussion once, and when she heard that, she said, no. It just goes into remission. You don't recover. So maybe some of us are in remission, we don't know. Well, at any rate, you're here, and so here goes. If you watch the Super Bowl over these last years, which we've already talked about, or possibly the Grammys, or even more recent TV ads, you likely have seen a curious ad entitled, He Gets Us. Anyone? Yeah. He, of course, turns out to be Jesus. Like me, I'm sure you were thinking, what? Who's behind this? How did it get on TV? Yet I also thought, it's pretty benign, even a bit touching and positive. Be childlike, it suggests, as did Jesus, and love your enemies, another of Jesus' challenges, and that Jesus loved the people we hate. So I did a little investigation. Alex Beam, a Boston Globe columnist, wrote about it, among others. Most of the money comes from the Green family and the Servant Foundation, Christian evangelicals, the folks connected to Hobby Lobby, maybe you remember, and some causes around religious liberty, supporting a baker who didn't want to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple, and healthcare workers who did not want to be part of abortion procedures, and so on. Turns out the ads received a lot of criticism. Interestingly, some on the left of the political spectrum who suggest Jesus wouldn't be in favor of spending money on such ads, making fascism look benign. And some on the right suggesting Jesus was never interested in public publicity campaign, and that the ads have done one of the worst services to Christianity in the modern era, accusing the ads of pandering to liberals, suggesting we have been taken for a ride by woke tricksters. When asked about the ads, a spokesman simply said, we want to spark a conversation about Jesus and Christianity. Fascinating, I thought. Mission accomplished. We're in the midst of an ideological war in this country, it seems to me, between left and right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberals, progressives, radicals. But there's also a war going on in Christianity, I would say, with the rise of the so-called Christian nationalists, with its anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBTQ folks, and I would suggest an anti-Jesus perspective as it spreads this rather violent message. And I think we're in perilous times. So much so that a few years back, a group of prominent Christian leaders put out a statement countering Christian nationalism, and they entitled their statement, "Reclaiming Jesus, a confession of faith in a time of crisis," proclaiming that we're in a dangerous crisis of moral and political leadership at the highest levels of government and our churches. We believe the soul of the nation and the integrity of faith is at stake. In this statement, they condemn white nationalism as racism, abuse of women, attack on immigrants and refugees, an attack on the truth with alternate facts, and blatant lying in civil life. The trends toward autocratic leadership and authoritarian rule with this rhetoric of America first, calling for a world of equal nations working for the common good. And as Christian leaders, they went on, they advocate for changing the world based on the ethic of justice and love preached by Jesus, and offering a reminder to leaders in this country that their primary role is to serve the common good, while reminding the church, in the words of Dr. King, that it is not the master or servant of the state, but rather its conscience. The first time I remember distinguishing Jesus from Christianity, believe it or not, was during seminary years, many years ago. I read a book by a South African priest named Jesus Before Christianity, an attempt to locate the historical Jesus, his own religious faith and practices, as a lifelong Jew. Maybe, as one Jewish friend from Pittsburgh told me, maybe the first Reformed Jew. Before his name became an object of worship as the Messiah, known as Christ, and the founder somehow of a new religion. Let's be clear, Jesus died a faithful Jew, never set out to form a new religion. Even after death, most of his followers were Jewish and still went to the temple. As time went on, eventually, maybe more than a century, the movement became more and more Gentile and moved away from its historical roots, tragically and slowly becoming, at times, anti-Semitic. A reputation, if you will, would have Jesus standing on his head. As the Christian mystic and theologian and friend of Unitarian Universalism, Howard Thurman, author of many books, one entitled Jesus and the Disinherited, he once wrote, "How different might have been the story of the last 2,000 years on a planet grown old from suffering if the link between Jesus and Israel had never been severed." In my own ministerial experience, I once had this profound encounter with this distinction between Jesus and a certain understanding of Christianity. I was asked to perform a wedding between a Christian woman and a Zoroastrian man who grew up in Pakistan. I met with the couple, and together we planned this interfaith ceremony, respectful of both traditions. It was a privilege to be part of. Interestingly, as it turned out, several of the man's immigrant cousins, also raised Zoroastrian, but once coming to the United States, converting to Christianity, after the service, they sat next to me as we ate, and they went on to condemn what I had just done. To them, it was a travesty, an insult to the true faith of Christianity, a blasphemy in their minds, a mockery of what they believed. As I listened and felt the viciousness of this attack, when they finished speaking, I simply said to them that I couldn't recognize either the person or the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth in their words, and that the Christian perspective they were articulating, I thought, had little to do with Jesus. Well, they were undeterred. But before the conversation ended, the two men's mother immediately saw what was going on and intervened, admonishing their verbal assaults and profoundly apologizing to me that I had to endure this experience. She later thanked me for facilitating this meaningful ceremony between a Zoroastrian boy and a young Christian bride. Like the authors of that document a few years back, Reclaiming Jesus, I took that unpleasant experience to reclaim Jesus and his historical witness of justice and love and compassion, juxtaposing what many have called the religion of Jesus versus the religion about Jesus. So, what about Unitarian Universalism and Jesus and his religion? Can we find Jesus in UU? Should we reclaim Jesus? If so, what would that mean? How would it matter? I think the truth is that UU, and maybe most of us, don't know what to do with Jesus and Christianity or the resurrection. The damage done by Christianity, not only historically, but in the current moment, as an element of it is being wedded to a vicious and violent attack on immigrants and Jews and LGBTQ folks, it's hard to deny and difficult to not associate all of that hate with a certain form of Christianity. And frankly, in modern times, UU has slowly distanced from that tradition, with some exceptions. One comment about UU has been that the only time the name Jesus is uttered in the church is when the janitor stubs his toe. But the truth is, at one point in our history, certainly Melanie and I encountered this in the early 90s, there was a good deal of hostility to Christianity. Many older UUs, and maybe some of us here, came into this UU movement from Christian roots, and we wanted to distance from unpleasant experiences, recovering, as we said earlier. They were called the come-outers, and this was written about a lot in UU in the 1980s and 90s, the come-outers. Many could be very intolerant of God talk, and especially Jesus. One time in Pittsburgh, while we were doing a charity event in a Lutheran church, one of the UU musicians said to me, "You know, Art, what really bothers me about playing in this church is that cross in the sanctuary. I'm okay with the G word, but I can't stand any talk of the J word." You know, it made me think of Gandhi, this great figure, Gandhi, who once said, while visiting the Sistine Chapel in Rome and eyeballing the painting of the crucified Christ, and I quote Gandhi, "What would not I have given to be able to bow my head before the living image of Christ crucified?" Noting that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount went straight to his heart. Gandhi often said that he loved Jesus, but not so much Christians, whom he said were so unlike Jesus. A man who was innocent, offered himself as a sacrifice for the good of others, including enemies, and became the ransom of the world. Now, one of our strengths as Unitarian Universalists, as we all know, is our openness to truth in all religions. Yet we have this uneasy relationship with Christianity and with Jesus, which many of us probably grew up in. So maybe it is time for us to reconsider reclaiming Jesus, the historical Jewish Jesus, not as our exclusive avenue to truth, but as a path that we have this connection to. You probably know your Unitarian history. William Ellery Channing, this preacher in Boston who was a Christian minister, gave this great speech, and at that moment, he was called by other Christians a Unitarian because he questioned this whole notion of Trinity. One of the interesting things about Channing is he challenged his more conservative Christian colleagues to be more focused on the Bible and not all this dogma that's been created over these centuries. He was biblically centered, Channing, and became the spokesperson for this new breakaway movement called Unitarianism in this country. From our Universalist side of the equation, the preacher and theologian Hosea Ballou, around the same time, a little bit earlier than Channing in the early 19th century, wrote, and I quote Channing, this Universalist, "Jesus was the greatest demonstration of God's intent. He came to show us all the path of love and set an example for us. He's the embodiment of God's love. In following Jesus, we can be reconciled to God." One of our great 20th century theologians, James Luther Adams, who helped me make a transition into Unitarian Universalism, served the church in Salem, and became a great professor at Harvard and Chicago. Adams argued that knowing and remaining connected to our roots is very important for our UU identity. Despite appearances at times, we are not a New Age religion. We have a long and profound history. We root ourselves to the left wing of the Protestant Reformation. And out of that Reformation came these whole notions of congregational polity and democratic process. Lay leadership, lay people are in charge. Ministers are the hired help, even in our callings. You folks run the show here. We're also products of the Enlightenment. We respect reason and human potential, as well as insights from science. The Older Testament prophets who proclaim God's justice and their heir in the Newer Testament, Jesus of Galilee, the Jewish prophet who gave us the Beatitudes, the most profound, I think, religious challenge to justice and love and compassion one could ever imagine, are a deep part of our Unitarian and Universalist roots. And I believe to reclaim them will help us grow in faith and wisdom as we also explore other religious paths. Interestingly, a great Jewish theologian of the last century, a German named Leo Beck, once said that of all the denominations he's encountered, he felt the Unitarians best understood who Jesus the Jew really was. You still with me? Okay. The other reason I will offer why we should reclaim the Jewish Jesus is here we are celebrating Passover, as Chris said earlier. We're celebrating Passover and Easter. I mean, UUs can do that, and it's wonderful to raise up this wonderful Jewish tradition of liberation from slavery. And Easter, new life, spring, new opportunities to rethink what we're about and what we're doing. It's a wonderful time, a wonderful religious history to raise up. And behind this is this person who you could say bridges this gap between Judaism and Christianity, Jesus. As you know, we're living in dangerous times, and what is masquerading in our culture as a form of Christianity is really white Christian nationalism. And I think with all our energies, we must resist that this is any serious form of what Jesus had in mind. There's a lot at stake here. Also, strategically, I think the best way to counter this Christian nationalism is to raise up the history of Jesus and know his teachings and to be able to counter this hate-filled form of Christianity and therefore, in that way, opposing it, as this wonderful document, Reclaiming Jesus, suggests. So, as UUs, we don't worship Jesus, but we emulate Jesus. practicing the religion of Jesus the Jew, not the religion about him so much. Even though I have a different world perspective than those who made up He Gets Us ads, I can't quarrel with the message. I think it's pretty authentic to the historical Jesus. At least I think I can dialogue with those folks, these Christian evangelicals, maybe even find some common ground. And I must admit, I love the image you may have seen they created of a little white boy and a little black boy running up to embrace one another. Maybe we should run an ad with two big men, black and white, doing the same thing, or two female immigrants, brown-skinned and speaking Spanish, with the same warm embrace as we work to bring all of us together. I have to admit, when I'm trying to discern right behavior or moral action in my everyday life, just what's the best thing to do, I still turn to the teachings of Jesus as some of the most challenging commands, or if you will, suggestions I can imagine. But be warned, reclaiming the real Jesus might make some of us squirm in our seats because of the demands of it. A great 20th century theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, taught at Union Seminary, once said that the job of Christians is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I'm remembering today that a few weeks ago, some of us remembered and celebrated the life of a great religious and political figure from El Salvador, St. Oscar Romero, a bishop who was murdered while celebrating Mass in 1980. After having sent a letter to Jimmy Carter begging him to stop sending money and weapons to the government of El Salvador that was murdering its people. He then got on the radio and said to Salvadoran soldiers, "Lay down your arms because you're killing your own people." A few days later, Oscar Romero was murdered. Much like the 4 U.S. churchwomen whom you remember, were brutally murdered and raped for following the dictates of Jesus. Oscar Romero said before he died, "If they kill me, I will rise in the Salvadoran people." Now there's an understanding of the resurrection we can live with. If they kill me, I will rise in the Salvadoran people. In the Bible story we read this morning, The Road to Emmaus, Jesus rose in the minds and hearts of his followers. They had a new consciousness, and they carried that message forward. Jesus had this social vision he called the kingdom, a vision of love and justice, but especially a vision that was inclusive of marginalized people, today's immigrants, today's gay people, all marginalized people. His vision conflicted with the Roman Empire and the priestly hierarchy in the temple, just like the 4 churchwomen and just like Oscar Romero, and they all were executed. When I decided to enter seminary many years ago, I was greatly influenced by a priest who spent years in jail for political activism, based on the message of Jesus. On a card I had printed at my ordination, I quoted him, and it reads like this: "And yet," reminds the priest and poet Daniel Berrigan, "there remains hope. When I say hope, I mean that we have available the breath and energy needed to approach the truth of things and to embrace it. I hope that this world lies within the providence of a child, a Jewish infant, hunted down, we are told, from his birth by the first of a long dynasty of Herods. Need we say more? I hope in this child. I hope that you may hope in him as well." So as we celebrate Passover and Easter, let us not allow the heresy of Christian nationalism to define this ancient tradition. While celebrating Palm Sunday in Rome, Pope Leo, born in Chicago, said this as he referred to the current war on Iran and the prayers of the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth. I quote Leo, Brothers and sisters, Jesus, the bringer of peace, rejects war, whom no one can deny to justify war. He does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects them, saying, "Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood." During this Passover Easter season, as we celebrate the resurrection, in whatever way you're able to do that, I hope it'll be a time for us either to find Jesus, maybe for the first time, or reclaim the real Jesus, or merely follow his lofty teachings and life, the bearer of hope for so many in a very challenging time. So be it. Amen.